Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hallowell, and today we're breaking down a very interesting story surrounding the Ten Commandments, and I'm joined by Ian Giatti. How's it going today?
Hey, Billy, how are you?
I'm doing well. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. The Ten Commandments, obviously, for Christians and Jews, it's incredibly important, the law. And these commandments, moral law, laws for respecting God, but they've really been popping up quite a bit in a political sense. Can you take us through, just before we get in specifically to the conversation that you had, what exactly has been going on in Louisiana and other places when it comes to the Ten Commandments?
Yeah, so this is kind of like a trend now that's picking up steam across several states over the last, I would say, last 2 years maybe. Um, States like Oklahoma and Louisiana have, through the legislative process, have decided that they want to, place the Ten Commandments into public school classrooms. And so now this is actually picking up some momentum here in Texas as well. And now there's legislation being introduced to do that. And it's likely to catch on in other states. So this has kind of become something of a talking point. Instantly, of course, this stuff raises questions about over the debate of Christian nationalism, as we've seen over the last few years, and what that means for the public school sector. And so now, we have this local pastor here in North Texas who's offering an alternative.
Okay, so and let's talk about this alternative because a lot of people get excited when they hear, okay, like, hey, the Ten Commandments are going to be in a school or they're going to be in a government building, and this is going to be an opportunity for the faith to be presented. You sat down and talked with this Dallas area pastor who had some different thoughts really on maybe how Christians should approach this. So let's sort of go through what his arguments are.
Yeah, so I got a chance to speak with Jeff Warren. He's the pastor at Park Cities Baptist Church in Highland Park, which is about, let's say, 15, 20 miles north of Dallas. And his whole thing was, look, we've seen such political divide in the church, not just, generally, but in the church over this idea of placing the Ten Commandments into the public sphere and what that means. His thought, generally speaking, was, why don't we introduce something that will make people think more deeply about what's behind this push to include the Ten Commandments? And his argument is that the Beatitudes perhaps more specifically and broadly encapsulate what it means to be a Christian, what Jesus preached when he was, here preaching during his ministry on earth and calling people with the gospel. And so, for Pastor Warren, the Beatitudes for him maybe got closer to what the New Testament church should be thinking about in the public sphere as opposed to the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, I mean, this idea, this question pops up. If you're mandating the Ten Commandments, are you in some way, and I'm not saying this is the case, I'm asking the question, forcing your views and beliefs on other people? And this is something that I know he even spoke about in a sermon, obviously on this topic back in November. Talk a little bit about that, because that feels to be the issue here, right? Like, are you pushing this on people who don't want it? On the flip side, is it something that people need to be reminded of because it's essential and incredibly important to how we should be living?
Right. Well, the Ten Commandments are obviously a foundational passage of Scripture. They're foundational for the church. Jesus speaks about them in his Sermon on the Mount, which is where we get the Beatitudes from. So they're not just this provisional, part of the Bible that some people visit and some people don't. And Pastor Warren even acknowledged that, and he said, "Look, I'm all for that, but why don't we talk about how we live these out?" And so I think for him, it was really, what is the application of the Ten Commandments? And then why aren't Christians, but in contrast, why aren't they pushing for something like the Beatitudes to be in public spaces? It's a sound argument. Why isn't there a push? Why is it only the Ten Commandments? I think one of the things we talked about most was he wanted to get to the heart of what Jesus was preaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And he understood that, look, Jesus recognized the authority of the Ten Commandments. But then his whole point of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes was actually to get to the posture of the heart and what it meant to obey those Ten Commandments and what that looks like when you live that out. And so I think, he referred to it as kind of a tongue in cheek recommendation, which leads me to personally believe that maybe he doesn't have 100% conviction in offering that. But I think it was more of a doctrinal challenge to not only his congregation, but Christians throughout America.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting too, because I think the Ten Commandments has a unique fixture in that it appeals to more than one. You have obviously Jews and Christians, and really it's hard to argue outside of the first few commandments that some people who don't believe in God would take issue with. The other ones, when it comes to loving other people, it's hard to argue against those things. So I think a lot of people see it as this is actually an easier thing to get instituted because it's a little more palatable to most people than maybe some of the things we might find in the New Testament. Yeah, I don't know if you want to reflect on that at all. It is interesting to me though how much more I think pervasive and known the Ten Commandments are.
Yeah, well, for me, and this is something I kind of Pastor Warren and I's conversation went into a little bit, and unfortunately, I can't fit it all into the page, but we talked about the meaning of the law in the New Testament and the application of the law. And he spoke at length about what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount. He was not denying that the law no longer applied or that the Ten Commandments were outdated or that people wouldn't understand them. He was actually confirming the authority of the Ten Commandments. And he was actually reiterating how important they are. And so he was
Mhm.
pointing to it, like he said, not just the heart posture, but the authority of the Ten Commandments even now, not to merit salvation, not to merit, any kind of righteousness before God, but just that they are still something that even in the New Testament theological structure, they still were at the foundation of what Jesus taught. And I thought that's super interesting. I thought that maybe that challenges all of us to go, well, yeah, maybe we can't just be, I know there's a lot of talk of New Testament only churches, right? So maybe we can't just be, swimming in the shallow end, so to speak, of the Beatitudes. Maybe we go, hey, what was Jesus referring to? We go back to the original scriptures. And I do believe that's what the pastor was pointing to is the continuity of the scriptures and that the Old Testament fully informs how Jesus preached and the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes that we're all familiar with today.
Yeah, and I think what he said about Christian nationalism, I want you to cover that a little bit because we hinted at it before, but I think this term Christian nationalism has caused a lot of debate, consternation. There's totally different views on it, but this idea that mandating the commandments in public schools would in some way be connected to quote unquote Christian nationalism. Can you break down what he had to say there?
Well, I can actually sum it up in one point that he made that I thought was absolutely fascinating. I plan to cover more because I hadn't really thought about it. And he was making the point from his perspective, but just as a journalist, I thought it was a fascinating view. And this is what he said. I'm going to read the quote. He said, "The first commandment points to a singular God who proclaims, 'You shall have no other gods before me.' That," he said, "is a clear violation of the Establishment Clause," end quote. And his point was that, look, if we're in a liberal democracy, we're promoting one or two religions. He was pointing to Judaism and Christianity. Then he said, then we have to promote them all. We have to promote Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. And it's a legitimate point. But I thought his statement about the first commandment being a violation of the Constitution was absolutely fascinating. I had never thought of it in that context. And so I think there's a lot for us there as the church to grapple with what that means, because does it indeed say if God says you shall have no other gods before me? Well, that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause in some people's eyes. And then we have a huge conversation about the US Constitution. So there's a lot there to unpack. Not enough time today to do that, but I fully plan on pursuing that in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, I think just as we close this conversation out, Christians do have to ask, every faith would have to ask this question, if my views are being represented, do I have to then mandate everyone else's views? And that's really what he's saying there. And I think it's an uncomfortable question for people. Yeah, because look, we know the school system has, the public schools have had a lot of issues, and a lot of those issues came after the removal of prayer and the removal of faith and values. And that doesn't mean that we have to say these things need to be mandated, but you have to have honest conversations, and they're uncomfortable and they're tough. And, you do have to find that balance of respecting other religions in a nation that, really is bent and built on doing so. So there's a lot there.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, I appreciate you taking the time. We will have the link in the description. People can check that out. And looking forward to you covering this more as the days and weeks go on.
Thank you, Billy.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post, and we'll be back next week with another episode of The Inside Story. We'll see you then.